My name is Samuel. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people describe with safe words: steady, reliable, low maintenance. I work in a professional office environment, the kind where job titles sound clean and impressive, and where people assume fairness exists simply because policies are written down somewhere. If you met me at work, you probably wouldn't remember much about me afterward. I'm not loud. I don't dominate meetings. I don't compete for attention. I learned early that being agreeable made life easier, and being competent without asking for credit kept the peace. Managers trusted me. Coworkers leaned on me. And because I didn't complain, people assumed I didn't need much. That assumption is where this story begins. This isn't a story about revenge. There's no shouting match, no dramatic walkout, no viral moment where someone gets publicly exposed. What happened unfolded quietly, over months, then years, through observation, patience, and a kind of clarity that only comes when you stop trying to be understood and start paying attention instead. At its surface, this is a story about money, about discovering that a coworker was earning $40,000 more than I was for the same job, about being told by HR that compensation details were confidential, and about a spreadsheet that said otherwise. But underneath that, this is really a story about perception, about what happens when you are consistently underestimated, not because you lack ability, but because you don't perform in the way others expect. It's about how systems quietly reward confidence over contribution, and how silence can be mistaken for consent. I want to be clear about something before we go further. I didn't set out to catch anyone. I wasn't looking for leverage. I didn't wake up one morning angry or bitter or ready to burn things down. What happened to me happened slowly, almost gently, the way unfairness often does when it's been normalized. As you listen, you might recognize moments that feel familiar: small dismissals, casual decisions made without you in the room, explanations that sound reasonable until you stack them side by side. You might also feel the urge to ask why I didn't speak up sooner. I've asked myself that question many times. This story follows the internal journey more than the external one. How quiet observation turns into strategy, how patience becomes power, and how choosing not to react can sometimes be the most disruptive move of all. There are consequences in this story, but they don't arrive with noise. They arrive with inevitability. I'm sharing this not to position myself as a hero or a victim, but as someone who finally chose to see clearly and act accordingly. If you've ever wondered whether staying calm means staying small, or whether fairness really does reveal itself to those who wait long enough, then this story might resonate with you. Before we go on, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever felt certain something wasn't right at work, even when everyone around you acted like it was? To them, I was dependable, not impressive, dependable. The kind of word that sounds like praise but comes with a ceiling. I was the person managers felt comfortable assigning things to without discussion. If a project needed saving, my name appeared quietly in an email thread. If something required precision, follow-through, or patience, it landed on my desk without ceremony. No one ever asked if I had the capacity. They just assumed I would make room. In meetings, I was the one who listened. I spoke when it was necessary, not when it was strategic. I didn't interrupt. I didn't repeat myself louder if someone talked over me. When my ideas resurfaced later through someone else's voice, I noticed. But I also noticed that pushing back seemed to make people uncomfortable, so I learned to let it pass. People often mistook my calm for a lack of ambition. I arrived early, left on time, and produced work that never needed fixing. That last part mattered more than anyone admitted. Mistakes were loud in our department. Competence was silent. And silence, I learned, blends into the background quickly. I wasn't ignored outright. That would have been obvious. Instead, I was included by default. Copied on emails. Invited to meetings where decisions had already been made. Asked for input after direction was set. Trusted with execution, not authorship. Over time, a role settled around me like a tailored jacket I never asked for. Reliable, low maintenance, not a flight risk. Managers spoke to me with relief in their voices. "We don't worry about you, Samuel." At first, I thought that was a compliment. It took years to understand it was also a justification for not checking in, not advocating, not reconsidering assumptions. When promotions came up, I was told my time would come. When raises were discussed, I was thanked for being understanding. When new hires arrived with louder personalities and sharper self-promotion, I was asked to help them get up to speed. And I did. I trained people who would later outrank me. I answered questions that made their performance reviews shine. I filled in gaps so effectively that the gaps disappeared, and with them, any visible need to reevaluate my position. This wasn't exploitation in the dramatic sense. No one twirled a mustache or plotted behind closed doors. It was more subtle than that. It was a system that quietly rewards those who ask and quietly leans on those who don't. I told myself stories to make it easier. I told myself I valued stability, that I didn't want to manage people, that money wasn't everything. Some of those things were true, but they weren't the whole truth. The deeper truth was that I had learned, long before this job, that being agreeable kept you safe, that being useful earned you belonging, and that making others comfortable often came at the cost of making yourself visible. So when small slights happened, I absorbed them. When my workload grew without a title change, I adjusted. When my responsibilities expanded without a compensation review, I adapted. When praise came without progression, I smiled and went back to my desk. I wasn't bitter, not yet. I was patient. And patience, when unexamined, can look a lot like consent. What no one seemed to notice was how closely I watched. I noticed patterns. Who negotiated, who didn't, who was described as valuable versus easy to work with, who received proactive updates about their future, and who was expected to wait quietly. I noticed how often fairness was spoken about abstractly, and how rarely it was applied consistently. Still, I stayed in my lane. I did my job. I kept my head down. I told myself that professionalism meant restraint, that dignity meant not making noise. And to them, that meant I was predictable, safe, invisible. They thought they understood who I was. They didn't realize that being underestimated doesn't erase awareness, it sharpens it. And while I wasn't preparing for anything yet, I was learning something important about the space I occupied. I was learning exactly how small they thought my presence was. The first moment I remember clearly wasn't dramatic. That's what made it dangerous. It happened during what was supposed to be a routine alignment meeting, one of those weekly check-ins where everyone nodded, agreed, and left with more work than clarity. I had spent the previous week untangling a reporting issue that had been quietly costing the team time and credibility. I didn't announce it. I just fixed it, documented the change, and included a short summary in the shared folder. When the meeting reached that agenda item, my manager scrolled through the document on the screen. "Oh," he said lightly, "looks like this is already resolved." He didn't say my name. Someone else spoke next, asking about the next steps. The conversation moved on. No acknowledgement, no follow-up question, no curiosity about how the issue had been solved so quickly. I told myself it didn't matter. The work was done. That was the point. But later that day, a colleague stopped by my desk. "Nice catch on that report," she said. "That could have been messy." She lowered her voice slightly, as if complimenting me was a private act. I thanked her, and she walked away. The moment ended there, unrecorded, unofficial, weightless. That was the first small cut. Not the lack of praise itself, but the way it disappeared into the cracks of the day. The way it mattered just enough to notice, but not enough to justify making a fuss. The kind of thing that, if you mentioned it, would make you sound petty. So I didn't mention it. A few weeks later, something similar happened. A process improvement I had suggested in writing, carefully, with data, was brought up in a larger meeting by someone else. This time it was praised, applauded even. The room responded positively. Heads nodded. My manager smiled. I sat there, listening to my own words echoed back to me with a different voice attached. No one looked at me. No one noticed the familiarity. And I didn't correct the record. I told myself the idea mattered more than the credit. That being territorial would undermine the collaborative culture we claim to value. But I wrote it down that night. Not in an official way, just a note in my worn leather notebook. Date, context, what was said, who said it. At the time, I didn't know why I did that. I wasn't building a case. I wasn't planning a confrontation. It just felt important to remember it accurately, without emotion. Then came the comment that stayed with me longer than it should have. During a performance check-in, my manager leaned back in his chair and said, "You're in a good spot, Samuel. You don't really need much." It was meant kindly, I think. I asked what he meant. "Well," he said, "some people are always pushing, asking what's next. You're steady, content. That's valuable." Content. I nodded. I thanked him. I left the meeting and went back to my desk. That night, I couldn't shake the word, not because it was inaccurate, but because it had been assigned to me without my consent. It wasn't something I had claimed for myself. It was something that made it easier for me to manage. From that point on, I started noticing how often assumptions replaced conversations. I was assumed to be fine with my workload, assumed to be fine with my title, assumed to be fine with my compensation. No one asked. They just continued. And every time something like that happened, I told myself the same thing. This is how workplaces are. Don't take it personally. But I did take it personally, quietly, internally, without reaction. I didn't vent. I didn't complain to coworkers. I didn't escalate. I just paid attention. The small cuts didn't bleed. They didn't leave marks anyone else could see, but they accumulated. And with each one, something shifted, not in my behavior, but in my awareness. I realized that being overlooked wasn't accidental. It was convenient. And convenience, once established, is rarely questioned. Disrespect doesn't usually arrive as an insult. It arrives as repetition. Once something happens more than once without consequence, it starts to feel like a pattern. And once a pattern feels familiar, the mind begins to soften its edges. You stop reacting. You stop questioning. You start explaining it away. That's what I did. When my responsibilities quietly expanded, I told myself it was a sign of trust. When I became the unofficial point person for issues outside my role, I reframed it as visibility. When deadlines tightened around my work but not around others, I assumed I was just better at handling pressure. I was always one justification away from staying quiet. Meetings followed a rhythm I could predict. Ideas from certain voices were treated as strategic. Ideas from others, including mine, were treated as operational, necessary but not remarkable. I noticed how often I was asked to support initiatives rather than lead them. How often is my calendar filled with execution, while others filled with vision? When I finished my part early, more was added, not because I had asked for growth, but because I had proven I could absorb it. No one said, Samuel can handle more because he won't push back. They didn't need to. The system learned it on its own. There was a moment that should have stopped me. A new hire joined our team. Same title, similar background, less experience in our specific systems. I was asked to onboard him. I walked him through processes I had refined over the years. I shared documentation I had built from scratch. I answered his questions patiently and thoroughly. 2 months later, in a team meeting, my manager praised him for ramping up incredibly fast. I felt a flicker of something then. Not anger, something colder. A realization that my contribution had become invisible even in its transfer to others. Still, I smiled. I nodded. I stayed professional. After that, it became easier for others to speak about me rather than to me. Samuel's fine with it. He doesn't mind. He's not really concerned about titles. These statements floated through conversations I wasn't fully part of, shaping decisions I hadn't been consulted on. And every time I became aware of one, I asked myself the same question: is this worth addressing? The answer was always unclear, because nothing was egregious. Nothing crossed a line that could be easily named. It was all technically reasonable. And that made it hard to challenge without sounding unreasonable myself. So I normalized it. I told myself I was choosing peace, that I was above office politics, that my work spoke for itself. But work doesn't speak. People do. And I wasn't speaking. What I didn't realize at the time was that silence doesn't stay neutral. Over time, it starts to communicate something on your behalf. In my case, it communicated acceptance. Once that narrative settled in, it shaped everything. My performance reviews became stable but static. My growth conversations became vague. My compensation discussions became deferred. There was always a future review cycle, a future restructuring, a future opportunity. I learned to stop asking when that future would arrive. Instead, I focused on being excellent where I was. I refined my skills. I deepened my knowledge. I became indispensable in ways that didn't translate cleanly into metrics, but absolutely kept things running. And because things were running, no one looked too closely. The disrespect became normalized, not because it was invisible, but because it was familiar. It fit the story everyone had unconsciously agreed upon, that I was steady, content, and not in need of recalibration. I participated in maintaining that story. That's the part I had to confront later. Because every time I chose not to correct an assumption, I reinforced it. Every time I absorbed a slight without acknowledgement, I taught others how to treat me. This isn't self-blame, it's recognition. I wasn't weak, I was conditioned. Conditioned to believe that speaking up required justification, that asking for fairness meant risking reputation, that silence was safer than clarity. And so the environment continued exactly as it was, comfortable for everyone else. Until one day, something small disrupted the pattern, not an argument. Not a confrontation, just a moment of awareness that refused to be rationalized away. Once I started paying closer attention, the role I'd been assigned became impossible to unsee. It wasn't written anywhere. No one had ever said it out loud, but it shaped how people interacted with me, what they expected from me, and, most importantly, what they didn't expect. I was the stabilizer, the person you rely on when something breaks, not the person you ask to redesign the system. I was trusted with responsibility, but not with influence. With execution, not direction, and because I delivered without friction, the role hardened around me. I began to notice how often my name came up in conversations that didn't include me. Samuel will handle it. Let's loop Samuel in. He's good with details. He doesn't need much context. He'll figure it out. These weren't insults. They were compliments of a particular kind. The kind that quietly erase your agency. The kind that defines your value narrowly enough to keep you useful, but not visible. When cross-functional projects came up, I was assigned tasks, not ownership. When strategic discussions happened, I was invited late, after direction had already been set. I was there to make things work, not to decide what should exist. And the thing is, I was good at that role. I took pride in it. I liked being the person who could be trusted to follow through. I liked knowing that when something was complicated or messy, I could bring order to it. That competence became part of my identity. But it also became a cage. Because once people decide who you are to them, they stop checking whether that role still fits. They stop asking what you want. They stop imagining you differently. I remember a conversation with a senior leader during a hallway chat. He asked how things were going. I gave an honest answer. Busy, but manageable. He nodded and said, "That's you. Always steady." Again, it was meant warmly, but it landed with weight. Always steady. Not growing, not stretching, not changing. Just there. I started to see how others on my team were allowed complexity that I wasn't. They could be ambitious and anxious, confident and demanding, vocal about their needs without being labeled difficult. I, on the other hand, was rewarded for being easy. Easy to assign to, easy to depend on, easy to overlook. The role required me to be competent without being disruptive, helpful without being demanding, and present without being prominent. And I had been playing it perfectly. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, that crystallized this realization. A project I had been deeply involved in from the beginning was nearing completion. In the final presentation to leadership, I was listed under supporting contributors. Someone else, who had joined halfway through, was listed as the project lead. I didn't challenge it. I told myself titles on slides didn't matter. But as I sat in that room, listening to leadership ask him questions about decisions I had made, something clicked into place. This wasn't about effort. It wasn't about merit. It was about narrative. And the narrative around me had been written without my input. I wasn't seen as someone who needed recognition, advancement, or recalibration. I was seen as infrastructure. Reliable, necessary, invisible until something went wrong. Once I understood that, a strange calm settled in. Not resentment, not anger. Clarity, because roles like that don't change through hard work alone. They change when the assumptions that sustain them are disrupted, and disruption doesn't always require confrontation. Sometimes it begins with an internal decision to stop performing the version of yourself that others find most convenient. I didn't act on that realization immediately. I didn't announce anything. I didn't pull away or push back. But I stopped interpreting my discomfort as impatience. I recognized it for what it was, a signal. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no email, no meeting that changed the trajectory of my role. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind that blends into every other one when you've been in the same environment long enough. I was reviewing a shared budget file, one I'd accessed dozens of times before, while double-checking numbers for a routine forecast. This wasn't unusual. Accuracy was part of my job. No one questioned why I was in that document. I had legitimate access, and I wasn't looking for anything beyond what I'd always looked for. But that day, something caught my eye. A tab I hadn't paid much attention to before. Not hidden, just overlooked. It listed compensation ranges tied to internal role codes. Not names, just identifiers. Clean, clinical, easy to ignore if you weren't looking closely. I hovered over it for a moment, then clicked. At first, I assumed I was misreading it. I checked the role code, then mine, then cross-referenced it with a separate HR document I'd worked with months earlier. The numbers didn't align. There was a range associated with my role that I wasn't anywhere near. That, by itself, wasn't shocking. Ranges are broad. People fall at different points. Experience varies. So I kept going. Another role code, identical to mine. Same level, same scope, same department. The number next to it was $40,000 higher. I didn't react immediately. I didn't feel a rush of anger or disbelief. I felt still, as if something I had suspected abstractly had just taken on a concrete shape. I checked again and again. Then I noticed something else. The higher number wasn't an outlier. It was consistent across projections, adjusted upward in future quarters, treated as baseline, not exception. This wasn't a mistake. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen longer than necessary. The room was quiet, no dramatic soundtrack, just the hum of the office and the faint click of a keyboard somewhere down the hall. What surprised me most wasn't the discrepancy. It was how calmly my mind reorganized around it. Suddenly, a lot of things made sense. the ease with which certain requests were granted for others, the way negotiations were framed as exceptions in some cases and impossibilities in others, the confidence with which some colleagues spoke about their value, and the accommodation that followed. This wasn't about performance. It was about perception and leverage. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't screenshot anything. I didn't even write it down right away. I closed the file. For the rest of the day, I moved through my tasks exactly as before. I answered questions. I attended a meeting. I sent a follow-up email. No one noticed anything different, but something fundamental had changed. For the first time, my discomfort wasn't vague. It wasn't emotional. It was measurable. And that made it actionable. That evening at home, I opened my notebook. I didn't write about unfairness. I didn't vent. I didn't assign blame. I wrote facts, roll code, compensation range, observed discrepancy, date. I wrote what I knew and what I didn't yet know. Then I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. If this isn't an accident, what does it mean? The answer wasn't flattering. It meant that the system was working exactly as designed, and I had been playing my part in it perfectly. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me quiet in a new way. Because once you see the structure clearly, outrage feels inefficient, emotion feels premature, clarity demands patience. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was upset, but because my mind kept tracing lines, connecting moments, revisiting conversations, reinterpreting past explanations with new context. By morning, I hadn't decided what I would do, but I knew what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't rush. I wouldn't react. I wouldn't ask a question I wasn't prepared to hear answered. The shift wasn't external. It was internal, and it changed how I understood silence itself. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been an habitual, something I'd fallen into through conditioning and convenience. Now, it was deliberate. I wasn't withholding out of fear or uncertainty. I was choosing not to speak because speaking too early would have cost me information. Nothing in my behavior shifted outwardly. That was important. I still showed up on time, still delivered clean work, still responded promptly. To anyone watching, I remained exactly who they believed me to be. But internally, I stopped explaining things away. When a request landed on my desk that clearly exceeded my role, I noted it. When praise arrived without progression, I logged it mentally. When decisions were made without my input that affected my workload, I stopped assuming oversight and started recognizing patterns. Silence, I realized, gives you access. People reveal more when they think you're not a variable. When they believe you won't challenge assumptions, they stop guarding their language. They speak freely around you. They include you in conversations without filtering implications. I listened. In meetings, I paid attention not just to what was said, but to what was framed as negotiable. And for whom? I noticed how certain colleagues were encouraged to ask for more, while others were subtly discouraged. How flexibility appeared where confidence existed, and rigidity where compliance had been demonstrated. I watched how HR conversations were described secondhand. Words like policy, equity, and consistency are used selectively, often to close discussions before they can fully open. And through all of it, my silence was misread. They thought I was unaware, unbothered, still content. That misunderstanding became an asset. I stopped volunteering additional context unless asked. Not out of spite, out of precision. I answered questions fully, but I no longer anticipated needs that weren't explicitly expressed. I allowed minor inefficiencies to surface instead of smoothing them over invisibly. Nothing broke, but things slowed just enough to be noticed. Still, no one connected that shift to me. They attributed it to workload, to cross-team friction, to timing. The idea that I was choosing restraint never crossed their minds. At one point, a manager joked, "Samuel's always the calm one. Nothing rattles him." I smiled politely, because it was true, but not for the reason they thought. Being underestimated removes pressure. When people don't see you as a decision maker, they don't monitor your internal process. They don't anticipate movement. They assume stasis. That assumption gave me time. Time to understand the system. Time to observe how decisions were justified. Time to see where information flowed and where it didn't. I didn't need to confront HR yet. I didn't need to reference the spreadsheet. I needed to know how much weight documentation actually carried and where accountability realistically landed. So I asked neutral questions, not about myself, about process. How are ranges reviewed? What triggers a comp adjustment? Is there a formal audit cycle? I asked them in group settings, framed as curiosity. No edge, no implication. The answers were consistent in tone, but vague in substance. We evaluate holistically. It depends on multiple factors. There's discretion involved. Discretion. That word stayed with me, because discretion always exists somewhere. The question is, who's allowed to access it? As weeks passed, I felt something unfamiliar but grounding. Control. Not over others, but over my own narrative. I wasn't rushing to correct perceptions anymore. I was letting them crystallize, because a stable misunderstanding is easier to work with than a shifting one. And still, I did nothing overt. No complaints, no demands, no emotional conversations. Just observation, patience, and restraint. People often think power announces itself, that it needs volume, presence, and assertion. But there's another form of power, one that waits until all variables are visible before moving. That's the kind I was learning to use. What they never noticed was how much information passed through me every day. Not because I was in charge, but because I was trusted. Trusted people get access, not always formal authority, but proximity. They're CC'd, they're looped in, they're asked to sanity check, to review, to validate. And I had been that person for a long time. Before, I treated that access as a responsibility to protect others from complexity. Now I treated it as something to understand. I began paying closer attention to how documents were structured, what was finalized, what was a draft, what was quietly adjusted quarter to quarter without announcement. I noticed how certain spreadsheets evolved, how assumptions were baked in early and then defended later as historical precedent. I didn't copy files. I didn't forward anything inappropriate. I stayed well within my permissions. What changed was how deliberately I read. I compared role codes across teams. I mapped responsibilities against titles. I noted where job descriptions had drifted without reclassification. I paid attention to how often exceptions were made and how rarely they were documented. And slowly, a picture formed. Compensation wasn't arbitrary. It followed a logic, not a fair one, but a consistent one. Those who negotiated early anchored high. Those who transferred internally often plateaued. Those who didn't ask were quietly optimized for cost. None of this was written in policy language, but it was visible in patterns. I started documenting, not obsessively, not dramatically, just enough to preserve accuracy. Dates, versions, language used. I learned how HR framed conversations when no one was challenging them. What phrases were used when something could be done versus when something would not be done. I learned the difference between policy and practice. Most importantly, I learned where responsibility diffused. No single person owned compensation decisions. Managers influenced. HR guided, finance approved, leadership signed off, which meant no single person felt accountable. That diffusion wasn't an accident. It was protective, and it meant that confronting the system emotionally would go nowhere. But engaging it structurally might. While all this was happening, I stayed exactly where I was. I didn't signal dissatisfaction. I didn't update my LinkedIn aggressively. I didn't hint at external offers. That part mattered. The moment you signal intent, people start managing risk. They close ranks. They sanitize language. They become careful. I needed them to be comfortable, so I remained the version of myself they expected. Steady, capable, quiet. What they never noticed was how I repositioned my internal value. I stopped tying my self-worth to recognition. That freed me from urgency. And urgency is what makes people sloppy. Instead, I focused on leverage, not as a threat, but as optionality. I updated my resume privately, aligning it with the reality of my responsibilities rather than my title. I reconnected with former colleagues, not to complain, just to reestablish context. I learned what my skill set looked like in environments that didn't benefit from my silence. None of this showed up at work. I still said yes when appropriate, still delivered on time, still played my role. But now, I understand it as a role, not an identity. There was a moment during this phase when someone joked, "You're like the backbone of this place." I smiled. Backbone support structure. They don't get thanked unless they break. That's when I knew preparation wasn't about proving my worth. It was about deciding what to do once worth was no longer up for debate. By the time I revisited the spreadsheet, the one with the compensation ranges, I saw it differently. Not as evidence of injustice, as confirmation of alignment. Everything made sense once you accepted the premise. The system wasn't broken. It was simply optimized around behaviors I had been encouraged to maintain. Quiet, reliable, non-disruptive. And because I fit that profile so well, the system had no incentive to change. Unless I did. Still, I haven't acted yet. Because preparation isn't just about information. It's about timing. And timing requires patience. Most people don't have. The real reveal didn't happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, as I cross-checked what I had been observing against what I already knew. Patterns, once seen clearly, stop feeling theoretical. They start feeling structural. And structure is where leverage lives. I returned to the compensation data carefully, this time with intention, not to confirm the disparity that was already clear, but to understand its boundaries. Who else fell into the same category? How often were adjustments made? Under what circumstances did numbers shift upward instead of stagnating? What emerged wasn't comforting, but it was consistent. People who transferred internally into my role were clustered at the lower end of the range. External hires came in higher, sometimes significantly so. Those who negotiated aggressively at entry were protected by the momentum of that initial decision. Those who didn't were quietly managed over time. Managed in this context meant contained. Contained by narratives about the budget. Contained by timing. Contained by patience framed as professionalism. The leverage wasn't just the spreadsheet. It was the contradiction between what the company said about fairness and what it actually practiced. The gap between policy language and lived reality. And that gap was well documented, just not consolidated. I didn't feel triumphant when I realized this. I felt sober, because leverage isn't power until you decide how and whether to use it. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my notebook open and asked myself a difficult question. What do I want from this? Not emotionally, practically. Did I want an adjustment, a reclassification, an apology, validation? The honest answer surprised me. I wanted alignment, not just for myself, but between what was said and what was done. I wanted to stop participating in a system that benefited from my silence while denying its existence. That clarity mattered because it shaped everything that followed. I realized that going to HR immediately would trigger defense, not reflection. HR's role isn't to correct inequity, it's to manage risk. And the fastest way to reduce risk is to minimize conversation. So instead of preparing an argument, I prepared a map. A map of responsibilities versus title. A map of compensation ranges versus actuals. A map of timelines, what I had been doing and for how long, without adjustment. I didn't frame it as a grievance, I framed it as a discrepancy, and I kept it private. No coworker knew, no manager suspected, no ally was recruited. That solitude was intentional. When people know you're sitting on something, they start projecting outcomes. They imagine drama, they brace for conflict. I needed the system unguarded. I also needed to be honest with myself about something uncomfortable. The system hadn't only failed me, I had adapted to it. That adaptation had kept me safe, respected, and underpaid. It had earned me goodwill, but not equity. And part of what I was uncovering was my own participation in maintaining that balance. That didn't make the disparity acceptable, but it did make my next move my responsibility. The private reveal wasn't just about money. It was about realizing that I had options, and that choosing not to use them had been a choice, not a limitation. Once that settled in, the urgency evaporated. I wasn't in a rush to be heard anymore. I was in a position to decide if I wanted to be. And that distinction changed everything. I slept well that night, not because the situation was resolved, but because it was finally clear. Clarity doesn't demand action immediately, but it does demand a decision. Once I understood what I was seeing, I laid out my options carefully, without dramatizing any of them. I treated it the way I treated work, methodically, without emotion clouding the assessment. Option 1 was the most obvious. Go to my manager, present the discrepancy, ask for an adjustment. It would be clean, direct, and likely framed as a misunderstanding. Best case, I'd get a partial correction. Worst case, I'd be told what I'd been told before. That compensation decisions were complex, constrained, and not personal. Even if it worked, something about that option felt incomplete. It would rely on their willingness to acknowledge what they had benefited from not seeing. Option 2 was HR. Formally, they existed for this. Equity, compliance, fairness, these were their words. But I had listened closely enough to know how those conversations tended to go. They would focus on procedure, not outcome. On confidentiality, not correction. I imagined sitting in that meeting, hearing the same phrases I'd already documented, and walking out with a polite explanation and no change. Option 3 was to leave quietly, find another role, negotiate well, reset my baseline elsewhere. This option was tempting. Clean exit, no confrontation, no explanation owed. But it came with a cost I couldn't ignore. Leaving would protect me, but it would leave the system intact. It would confirm the narrative that people like me simply move on, silently absorbing inequity as a personal inconvenience rather than a structural issue. There was a fourth option, the one I hadn't considered until everything else was laid out. Do nothing outwardly, and move internally, structurally, in a way that couldn't be reversed once set in motion. This option didn't involve threats or ultimatums. It didn't rely on convincing anyone of my worth. It didn't require an immediate conversation. It required patience and acceptance of consequence. Because once you choose it, you can't pretend you're just observing anymore. You're acting. What tipped the scale wasn't anger. It was a moment during a routine meeting when someone casually said, Samuel doesn't really need growth right now. He's solid where he is. It was said kindly, almost protectively, and that's when I understood something fundamental. As long as I allowed others to define my needs for me, I would never outgrow the role they'd assigned. So I chose the irreversible option, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. I decided I would stop cushioning the system from the consequences of its own design. I wouldn't sabotage anything. I wouldn't underperform. I wouldn't withhold required work. But I would stop compensating invisibly. No more filling gaps without acknowledgement. No more translating ambiguity into clarity for free. No more absorbing structural inefficiencies as personal responsibility. And in parallel, I would begin positioning myself, legally, professionally, financially, for a future that didn't depend on internal correction. This wasn't a threat. It was alignment. I didn't announce this decision. I didn't write it down in a way anyone else could see. But once it was made, I felt something settle. Not relief, resolve. Because this path meant accepting whatever came next without scrambling to control the narrative. It meant trusting the preparation I'd already done. And most importantly, it meant I was done waiting for permission to be treated fairly. Once the decision was made, movement didn't look like motion. That was the point. I didn't change my tone. I didn't change my availability. I didn't signal dissatisfaction or ambition. From the outside, nothing shifted. Inside, everything was aligned toward one direction. I started with boundaries that looked like professionalism. I responded within working hours, no earlier, no later. I completed tasks to specification, no embellishment, no unpaid optimization. I asked clarifying questions instead of filling in assumptions. This wasn't disengagement. It was precision. The system had been relying on my tendency to anticipate needs before they were articulated. Removing that invisible labor didn't break anything, but it exposed friction that had been hidden. Meetings ran longer. Decisions required more follow-up. Small delays surfaced. No one blamed me. They didn't even connect it to me. They blamed the process. That was telling. In parallel, I took steps that had nothing to do with anyone else. I reviewed my employment agreement, not with suspicion, but with clarity. I made sure I understood notice periods, non-compete language, and intellectual property boundaries. I confirmed that everything I had documented fell squarely within my role and permissions. I consulted no lawyers. I filed no complaints. I simply removed ambiguity. Financially, I did the same. I ran my own numbers. What does staying cost me annually? What leaving might look like at different compensation points? How long could comfortably wait if I needed to? Knowing those numbers stripped the situation of fear. When you know you're not trapped, urgency loses its grip. Professionally, I prepared quietly. I didn't broadcast my availability. I didn't chase offers. I reconnected with people who already knew my work. Conversations were casual, exploratory. No complaints, no narratives of injustice. Just facts. This is what I do. This is what I've been responsible for. This is what I'm considering next. No one questioned my value. That too was telling. At work, people continued as usual. Managers delegated. HR circulated updates. Colleagues planned around assumptions that hadn't been challenged. And because I wasn't pushing, no one felt pressure to reevaluate anything. Silence kept them comfortable. What they didn't realize was that comfort was temporary. Because systems that rely on invisible labor only feel stable as long as that labor remains invisible. I wasn't withdrawing. I was making my contribution legible, and legibility changes dynamics. There was a moment during this phase when a manager asked, slightly puzzled, "Is everything okay? You seem more by the book lately." I smiled and said, "Just trying to be clear." He nodded, relieved. Clarity, after all, sounds harmless. Still, no one noticed the larger shift. They didn't see that I was no longer cushioning decisions from their consequences, that I was no longer absorbing ambiguity as a personal duty. They didn't notice because nothing had broken yet. That comes later. The consequences didn't arrive with conflict. They arrived with confusion. At first, it showed up as small questions, ones that hadn't been asked before because the answers had always appeared automatically. Do we know who owns this? Has this been reviewed yet? Why is this taking longer than usual? No one said my name. No one framed it as a problem. The questions hovered in meetings like light static, briefly acknowledged and then deferred. I watched it happen with a strange sense of distance, because nothing was missing. Everything I was responsible for was done, documented, delivered. What had changed was that the system no longer had a silent buffer. Before, if something was unclear, I clarified it without being asked. If two teams were misaligned, I translated. If a decision was vague, I interpreted it into action. Now I waited, not passively, professionally. If a task lacked context, I asked for it. If a request conflicted with another priority, I surfaced the trade-off. If a decision required authority I didn't have, I deferred it back. These were all reasonable behaviors. They were, in fact, encouraged, on paper, but they slowed things down. And for the first time, people had to experience the system as it actually was, not as I had been quietly compensating for it. The discomfort wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. Deadlines slipped slightly. Meetings multiplied. Emails grew longer. No one could point to a failure, but no one could ignore the friction either. I noticed managers starting to check in with each other more often. I heard phrases like, "We might need to revisit this process," and "We should probably clarify ownership here." These weren't reactions to me. They were reactions to the absence of something they hadn't realized they were relying on. At one point, a colleague said, half joking, "I don't know how Samuel used to just know what to do here." I was sitting right there. I smiled and said, "I usually waited for clarity," which was true, just not the whole truth. The most interesting part was how quickly the narrative began to shift, without ever naming the cause. Suddenly, my workload was being discussed more explicitly. Tasks that had always defaulted to me were now being negotiated. Questions about scope and responsibility were raised in forums where they hadn't been before. It wasn't appreciation yet. It was awareness. And awareness is uncomfortable. I didn't enjoy this phase. That's important to say. There was no satisfaction in watching others struggle. No pleasure in friction. If anything, it reinforced how much invisible labor I had been providing, and how little of it had been recognized. But I also didn't rush to fix it, because fixing it would have restored the illusion. Instead, I stayed steady. I answered when asked. I clarified when needed. I didn't rescue situations that weren't mine to rescue. The system began to feel its own weight, not enough to collapse, but enough to be noticed. That's when the questions started to turn toward me. Not accusations, curiosity. "You've been here a long time," someone said. "How do you usually handle this?" Usually, past tense. That was new. And with that shift came something else, a subtle recalibration of how people spoke around me. Less assumption, more inquiry. Still, no one mentioned money. No one referenced compensation or equity. But the conditions that had allowed those conversations to be avoided were changing, because the cost of not addressing them was starting to show. Quietly. By the time anyone thought to ask what had changed, the conditions that made change easy were already gone. That's the thing about quiet systems. They don't signal distress until the buffer is exhausted. And once it is, the realization doesn't arrive as insight. It arrives as urgency. I noticed the shift in tone before I noticed the shift in behavior. Conversations became tighter. Meetings gained an edge of impatience. People started referencing timelines instead of outcomes. Where there had once been ease, there was now pressure. Not on me, around me. Managers began to sense that something was off, but they didn't know where to locate it. Because nothing had broken in a way that could be escalated. No missed deliverables, no complaints, no policy violations. Just friction. So they did what organizations often do when faced with discomfort they don't understand. They tried to smooth it over. Suddenly, I was being asked how I felt about my workload, whether I needed support, whether there were any concerns I wanted to raise. These questions came late, not because they were insincere, but because they were reactive. They were being asked not out of curiosity, but out of anxiety. I answered honestly, but narrowly. "I'm fine. I'm managing what's assigned. Everything's clear." All of that was true. What I didn't do was reopen the door I had already walked past. Because the moment for informal correction, the moment where a quiet conversation could have reset expectations without consequence, had passed. They didn't realize that yet. One manager suggested a reset meeting. Another floated the idea of redistributing responsibilities. HR mentioned a potential review cycle adjustment in vague terms. All of these were attempts to regain equilibrium without examining cause. But equilibrium built on invisible labor can't be restored once that labor has been made visible. The most telling moment came during a leadership discussion I was invited into, earlier than usual. Someone said, "We might have underestimated how much institutional knowledge Samuel carries." There it was. Not acknowledgement, regret. But regret doesn't move systems backward. It only highlights the cost of delay. By then, I had already aligned my next steps. Not emotionally, logistically. My options no longer depended on internal correction. And that meant the leverage dynamic had shifted permanently. Even if they fixed the number tomorrow, the story had changed. They weren't offering fairness proactively. They were reacting to strain. And once that happens, trust doesn't recover cleanly. I could feel the confusion around me. Why hadn't I spoken up sooner? Why didn't I ask? Why didn't I signal dissatisfaction? These questions circulated quietly, framed as introspection, but they missed the point. I had spoken. Inconsistency. in contribution, in restraint. They just hadn't been listening. By the time the idea of a compensation conversation was floated seriously, it came with qualifiers. Let's see what's possible. There are constraints. We want to be fair, but fairness with conditions isn't fairness. It's negotiation. And I was no longer negotiating from a place of need. That's when I understood something clearly. Even if they wanted to fix it now, they couldn't undo the delay. Because what had been damaged wasn't just compensation alignment. It was credibility, their ability to claim they saw me accurately, their ability to claim they valued me consistently. Too much time had passed with too little curiosity. And while they scrambled to stabilize, I stayed calm, not out of detachment, but acceptance. The system was responding exactly as systems do when consequences arrive late, with panic. The conversation everyone had been circling finally happened on a Tuesday morning. No raised voices, no closed-door drama, just a calendar invite titled Check-In. 3 people, 30 minutes. I walked in with nothing in my hands. No folder, no printouts, no evidence to present. I didn't need them anymore. The room felt polite in that careful way people adopt when they sense something significant but don't want to name it. HR opened with appreciation. My manager followed with concern. Someone used the phrase long-term value. I listened. Then I spoke. Not about feelings, not about fairness, about facts. I described my role as it existed, not as it was titled. I listed responsibilities, timelines, scope. I referenced outcomes, not effort. I didn't mention the spreadsheet. I didn't accuse. I didn't ask for an explanation. I simply aligned the narrative. There was a pause after I finished. HR responded with language I had already heard in other contexts. Acknowledgement, process, constraints. They said compensation details were confidential, that ranges existed, that adjustments required cycles. I nodded. Then I said calmly, I understand. I've taken time to understand as well. That's when the temperature changed. Not heated, just focused. I explained that I wasn't asking for immediate correction. I wasn't presenting an ultimatum. I was informing them that my understanding of my position had changed and that I was acting accordingly. I didn't threaten to leave. I didn't reference external options. I didn't raise my voice. I said, I'm no longer comfortable operating under assumptions that don't reflect reality. I'm open to alignment. I'm also prepared for change. Nothing dramatic, just clarity. They asked if I had concerns about equity. I said, I have clarity about my options. They asked what outcome I wanted. I said, consistency. That word landed heavier than any demand, because consistency can't be promised without commitment. The meeting ended without resolution. No number, no decision, just acknowledgement that things would be reviewed. That was fine. I wasn't there to win a conversation. I was there to close a chapter. As I left the room, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not relief. Completion. I had spoken when it mattered, without heat, without spectacle, without compromising myself. And that mattered more than the outcome. Who I am now is quieter, but not smaller. That's the difference people often miss. After that meeting, things didn't resolve neatly. There was no sudden alignment, no dramatic correction that made the story feel fair in hindsight. What happened instead was slower, more honest. The organization tried to adjust, but only within the limits of what it was willing to admit. There were conversations, there were acknowledgments, there were phrases like, we didn't realize, and in retrospect. And there were offers, carefully framed, cautiously scoped. I listened to them with respect, and I declined to let them redefine me again. Because by then, my identity was no longer tied to how well I fit inside that system. I had stopped seeing myself as the reliable one, the steady one, the person who didn't need much. Those were traits I possessed, but they were no longer the story I lived inside. Instead, I understood myself as someone who observes before acting, someone who doesn't confuse silence with submission, someone who values alignment over approval. That shift changed how I moved through everything. At work, I was still professional, still thoughtful, still composed, but I no longer carried the quiet hope that being good would eventually be noticed. I no longer waited for recognition to arrive as a reward for endurance. Outside of work, the change was more visible. I spoke more directly. I negotiated without apology. I asked questions early, before assumptions could settle. Not because I was hardened, but because I was clearer. There's a kind of peace that comes from knowing you didn't abandon yourself to stay comfortable. From knowing that when the moment came to speak, you did. Without bitterness, without performance, without needing to be seen as the good one. I don't regret the years I spent being underestimated. They taught me how systems work when you're not loud enough to be accommodated and not disruptive enough to be feared. They taught me how value can be extracted quietly and how easily it can be overlooked. But they also taught me something else. That dignity isn't something you demand from others. It's something you practice internally, long before anyone else notices. I didn't become someone new through this experience. I became more accurate about my limits, more accurate about my leverage, more accurate about what I'm willing to tolerate, and perhaps most importantly, more accurate about the cost of staying silent for the sake of ease. There's no anger left in this story for me, just clarity. And clarity has a way of simplifying things. It tells you where you belong and where you don't. It tells you when to speak and when to move. That's who I am now. There's a reason I wanted to tell this story all the way through, without cutting to the moment of discovery or the conversation at the end. Because the truth is, what happened to me didn't begin with a spreadsheet, and it didn't end with a meeting. It began with a role I accepted without questioning, and it ended when I stopped confusing being easy with being valued. The moral of this story isn't always speak up. It isn't HR is bad, and it definitely isn't revenge works. It's quieter than that. Systems don't exploit people by accident. They respond to patterns. And when someone consistently absorbs more than they're compensated for, emotionally, cognitively, financially, the system learns that this is efficient, not malicious. Efficient. What changes things isn't outrage. It's awareness. Awareness of what you're providing that isn't visible. Awareness of what assumptions others are making on your behalf. Awareness of the difference between patience and self-erasure. The moment you see that clearly, you have a choice. You can confront, you can leave, or you can stop performing the version of yourself that keeps things comfortable for everyone but you. None of those choices are easy, and none of them are universally right. What matters is that the choice is conscious. For a long time, mine wasn't. I stayed quiet because it felt professional, because I didn't want to seem difficult, because I believed fairness would eventually recognize consistency. But fairness doesn't arrive on its own. It has to be aligned. Sometimes alignment comes through conversation, sometimes it comes through departure, and sometimes it comes through silence that is no longer passive, but intentional. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. Being underestimated doesn't make you powerless. It gives you time. Time to observe, time to understand, time to decide who you want to be when the moment comes to act. You don't need to announce your worth for it to exist, but you do need to stop giving it away invisibly. I didn't tell this story to position myself as an example to follow. I told it because I know how common it is, and how rarely it's talked about without drama. So I'll end with a question, not a conclusion. Have you ever realized, quietly, over time, that the role you were playing was benefiting everyone except you? If so, what did you do next?